One day, the coin in your pocket has the king's face on it. The next day, that king is dead, and so is everything that coin could buy. His palace is on fire, his army is gone, his name is being scraped off the statues, and now you're standing in the marketplace holding a piece of metal that nobody wants to touch. This was what happened to money when kingdoms fell. Rome. You see, Rome didn't fall in a day. Everyone knows that. But Rome's economy didn't fall in a day either. It fell slowly, quietly, and with a paper trail that would make a modern forensic accountant weep into their coffee. It started with the coins. In the early Roman Empire, a silver denarius was actually silver, about 90% silver. You could hold it up to the light, feel the weight of it, bite it if you were that kind of person, and know that what you were holding was real. The Roman economy ran on that trust. Trade happened because of that trust, and soldiers fought for wages paid in that trust. Then, the empire started to become very expensive to run, and Rome was fighting wars in many places at the same time. Its borders were huge and always needed soldiers to protect them, and the army had to be paid no matter what, even when there wasn't enough money. So, emperors also spent a lot building big things: roads, statues, and entire cities. These projects made people admire them, and being liked helped them stay alive, which was very important for a Roman emperor. So they came up with a simple but bad solution. They started putting a little less silver into each coin. Not enough for people to notice right away, not enough for a trader to look at a coin and say, "Something is wrong." Just a tiny change each time. Little by little, the coins became weaker, and by the 3rd century AD, the main coin, the denarius, had only about 2% silver left, just 2%. It was almost just a bronze coin covered with a thin layer of silver and held together by people's belief that it still had value. And this is where it becomes almost funny, but also painful. The Roman government kept saying the coins were still fine. They made official announcements and strict laws. They even tried to control prices so things wouldn't get too expensive, even though the money itself was losing value. In 301 AD, Emperor Diocletian made a law called the Edict on Maximum Prices. It set fixed prices for many goods across the empire. If someone charged more, they could be punished. But people didn't follow it. Merchants started hiding their goods. Some closed their shops, others simply refused to sell at those prices. You can't threaten inflation. Inflation doesn't listen. It doesn't care about laws or punishments. The Roman government was trying to argue with basic math. Math won, and math always wins. When Rome finally broke apart in 476 AD, the money system broke too. People stopped trusting coins the way they used to. Many people started saving gold because gold kept its value. Silver coins were not trusted anymore because they had been weakened over time. In many villages, people stopped using money at all. They went back to trading goods like food for tools or clothes for animals. Land became the most important kind of wealth. You could see it, use it, and it did not depend on the government to have value. The people who stayed rich were not the ones with the most coins. They were the ones who saw the problem early and changed their money into things that would last, like gold and land. Rome took hundreds of years to slowly fall apart, but some kingdoms collapsed much faster. If Rome was like a slow leak, then the next example is like a pipe bursting, quick, loud, and even more chaotic with money problems.
The Song Dynasty. China's Song Dynasty was the first to create paper money. Take a moment to think about that. Around 1000 AD, traders in Sichuan started using paper notes. You give someone your heavy copper coins, and they give you a light piece of paper instead. You can travel without carrying heavy metal, then exchange the paper back into coins later. It was smart, it was simple, it was the early version of modern banking. The government noticed this and took control of it. The Song Dynasty began printing official paper money called jiuzi. At first, it worked very well. Trade became faster, the economy grew, Money was easier to move and use than metal coins. But then, war began. The Jin dynasty attacked from the north. At the same time, the Mongol Empire was rising fast. The government needed a lot of money for soldiers, for weapons, for walls, and for survival. So they printed more jiuzi, then more, then a lot more. The paper money slowly started to lose value, not all at once, but little by little. Prices began to rise even though the amount written on the notes stayed the same. A merchant who accepted payment in the morning would notice that by the afternoon, that same money could buy less. People began to lose trust in the paper money, so they started asking for payment in things they could touch, like copper coins, silk, or grain, because those things could not be printed by the government. The Song dynasty tried to fix the problem by creating new paper money to replace the old ones, but there was a catch. They offered the new notes at a discount. In simple terms, people had to bring in their old money, which was already losing value, and exchange it for new money that was worth even less than expected. They did this again and again. Each new version of the money came with more promises about its value, but fewer real guarantees about what it could actually buy. It was one of the earliest examples of what we now call large-scale money printing to support a struggling economy, and it happened during a time when the dynasty was also losing wars. The result was not good. When the Song dynasty finally fell to the Mongols in 1279, many ordinary people were left with paper money that had lost almost all of its value. Over time, it had been reduced again and again until it could barely buy anything. Some people reacted the same way Romans once did. They stopped trusting paper money and turned their wealth into real things like silk, bronze, food, or land. But many others lost everything they had saved. The Mongols later created their own paper money called the chow. At first, it worked, but it was managed so heavily that it also lost value and eventually failed. When Marco Polo visited China, he was amazed that paper money even worked at all. But what he didn't fully realize was that he was seeing a system that had already gone through major collapse and recovery cycles. Paper was only the beginning, because the biggest money problems in history didn't just happen with coins or paper. They happened when entire societies had to rethink what money even means. And no civilization showed this more dramatically than the one that started with grain receipts and accidentally.
Babylon, 539 BC. Cyrus the Great and his Persian army entered the city of Babylon, a place that was believed to be almost impossible to conquer. It was one of the richest and most powerful cities in the world. The king was gone, the government was gone, but the city did not fall in chaos. What is surprising is how quietly it happened. The gates opened, and the Persians simply walked in. There was no dramatic final battle inside the city itself. Babylon's economy was not based on coins like Rome. Instead, it worked through clay tablets. These were small pieces of baked clay that recorded debts, loans, and payments. In other words, the clay tablet was the money system. It was proof of who owed what to whom. Even temples acted like banks, storing records and managing loans. When Cyrus took over, something unexpected happened. The clay tablets did not lose their value. The debts written on them did not disappear just because a new ruler was in charge. One famous banking family, the Igebe family, simply continued their work. They kept their records, updated their accounts, and started dealing with Persian officials instead of Babylonian ones. So even though the kingdom changed, the financial system mostly continued. The empire collapsed, but the receipts survived, and the bankers just kept going. This is not a small detail. The records of the Igebe family, thousands of clay tablets that still exist today in museums, show something remarkable. They were a banking family that kept operating through multiple changes of power over more than 100 years. They survived the fall of Babylon, they survived the Persian takeover, and they continued their work even as governments rose and fell around them. They kept lending money, they kept collecting debts, they kept recording transactions. They simply adapted to whoever was in charge at the time. What they seemed to understand, long before anyone formally explained it, is that money is not just a ruler's face stamped on a coin. Money is trust.
and trust can continue even when governments change as long as the system behind it still works and is still useful to those in power. The Agibi family didn't survive because they were loyal to one empire. They survived because they were useful enough that no empire could afford to remove them. It is 330 BC. Alexander the Great enters Persepolis and finds something that completely changes how wealth works in the ancient world. The Persian Empire had been collecting taxes and tribute from many lands for over 200 years. All of this wealth was stored in Persepolis, not invested, not spent, just stored. Gold, silver, coins, bars, massive amounts of treasure sitting in stone rooms. Historians estimate that Alexander found between 120,000 and 180,000 talents of precious metal. A talent was roughly the amount of weight a person could carry, so this was an almost unimaginable pile of wealth. When the vaults were opened, it must have felt unreal, metal everywhere, enough wealth to freeze thought for a moment. But the real shock was what happened next. The Persian system had kept this money locked away. It was not moving through trade or wages. It was just sitting there, inactive. Alexander changed that immediately. He began spending it, paying soldiers, rewarding generals, building cities, and funding his empire. This suddenly released a huge amount of money into the economy all at once. The result was rapid inflation in parts of the Greek world. Prices rose because there was suddenly far more money in circulation than before. A soldier who had saved carefully for years discovered that his savings could now buy much less than they used to. A massive hidden wealth had turned into a sudden economic shock. Alexander the Great understood that simply releasing all that stored wealth into the economy could cause serious disruption, so he tried to manage the problem in a different way. One of his main solutions was to build cities. These cities were meant to act as new economic centers, places where money could be used, traded, and put back into productive activity instead of just causing price shocks. The most successful of these was Alexandria in Egypt. It became a major hub of trade, learning, and commerce. Alexander founded more than 70 cities named Alexandria across his empire, though not all of them grew into important centers. The idea was simple: turn sudden, concentrated wealth into long-term infrastructure that could support a stable economy. And in many ways, it worked, at least partially. Over time, the shock of inflation began to settle. New Greek-influenced economies developed across the regions he conquered, and they became more active and productive. But for ordinary people, farmers, traders, and small merchants, the change was immediate and confusing. They had no warning and no protection from the sudden shift in prices and value. They just had to adapt as everything around them changed. The wealth of a king had been turned into a problem for everyone else. And in history, that is often how it happens. Every kingdom that ever collapsed left behind a similar kind of mess. Coins still existed, but the kings on them were dead. Clay tablets still existed, but the institutions behind them were gone. Paper money still existed, but the governments that guaranteed it had disappeared. Promises were still written down, but the currencies they referred to no longer meant anything in real life. But in every collapse, the same basic things kept their value. Land survived because land can always produce food or resources. Gold survived, not because it has special powers, but because people everywhere tend to trust it when everything else becomes uncertain. Skills survive too. The baker can still bake, and the blacksmith still knows how to work metal, even when money stops working properly. And people who understood systems survived as well. Families like the Agibi family kept records and adapted through political changes. Traders spread their risk across many routes so that no single collapse could destroy them. Wealthy landowners noticed early signs of currency weakness and quietly moved their wealth into land and property before things fell apart. When kingdoms fall, money does not truly disappear. It simply changes form. It moves from whatever system people no longer trust into whatever system they still believe will hold value. The face on the coin changes, the material changes, sometimes the entire idea of money changes.
But the real foundation never changes. Because underneath all of it is something simple. People need a way to measure value, store it, and trade it with strangers they may never meet. That need does not belong to any empire. It belongs to humans, and humans have a habit of continuing to live and trade long after their governments stop existing.